This could be good for everyone. The voice of his mother made Brian stop. She was with his father in the room talking about him. Why do you think that? Brian's father sounded surprised. Don't you think he needs to be here with people who know how to care for him? Brian peered around the wall, dark blonde hair falling over his eyes. He watched as his mother rose from the bed, arguing her point. Look, she said, this has been a tough couple of months for us all. She sighed and put a hand on her husband's arm. Don't you think we could use a break? A break? From our son? Brian's father shook his head and crossed his arms. Even with his split personality, he's our responsibility. Brian frowned and moved away from their room. There it was again. His disorder. His split personality. He hated those words. Brian had been normal for 16 years. Then a couple of months after his 17th birthday, it happened. He couldn't remember what exactly it was. But soon after, his split personality was everything that defined him. He had been taken out of public school when his father decided it was best for him to be homeschooled. Brian lost what little friends he had and became isolated from the rest of the world. Brian knew he wasn't crazy and tried to convince his parents he was fine. The other side of him could be controlled if he tried hard enough. Son? His father called before Brian reached the end of the hall. Yeah? Your mother and I would... He glanced at his wife behind him, her arms crossed. Oh, you would like to talk to you. Brian forced a smile and nodded. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, pale morning light filtering in through the window. Brian found that he had a hard time sitting still, feeling like there was something urging him to stand. We thought you might want to get out a little bit, said his mother pleasantly. Get out how? Brian asked uncertainly. He fidgeted with his hands. Out of the house, and we... Brian didn't hear the rest. His attention snapped to the flood of emotions inside of him. A roaring sound filled his ears. Under the table, Brian's hands turned to fists, nails digging into his palm. His breathing quickened, and he clenched his teeth, fighting back the urge to do things he knew he shouldn't. Brian? His mother was watching him, worry etched on her every feature. Sorry, Mom, he said, his voice tight. Can you repeat that? His mom shot her husband a wary glance. Aunt Mandy, she said slowly, would like for you to take a trip to the cabin with her and her kids this weekend. Brian listened this time, his eyes carefully trained on his mother. Suddenly, that painful rage took hold of him again. He was slowly losing control. It's entirely... I'll go. Brian gasped out, cutting his father off. You sure? Yes, Brian said a little too loudly. He stood, almost knocking his chair back. I'll go. Tell them I'm going. Brian fled to his room as he began to shake. He slammed the door shut behind him and threw himself on his bed, holding back a scream. Brian held a pillow over his face for a few seconds and then threw it at the wall. He clawed at the sides of his face, tears quietly streaming down his cheeks. "I'm not crazy," Brian told himself under his breath. "I'm not crazy." After some time, the fire that fueled his rage died. It went as quickly as it had come, and Brian fell back on his bed, staring at the ceiling and breathing heavily. A knock on his door made Brian jump. He said nothing as his door was pushed open and his father entered. He looked cautious, eyeing Brian carefully. Brian sat up, drawing in his knees. His father couldn't see him like this. "Son," his father began, sitting down next to him. Suddenly, his eyes widened, and he lifted his fingers to the side of Brian's face. "What did you do?" Brian looked at him questioningly for a moment, and then he let his own fingers find the small cuts he had made. When he pulled his hand away, spots of blood covered his fingers. "You said it was getting better." His father stood up, face clouded in worry. "What else have you been doing?" Brian kept a blank expression and watched his father. Of course, Brian wouldn't tell him how he fought the monsters inside of him. He didn't want to see his therapist more than he had to. "You need to tell me and your mother these things, Brian." His father threw his hands in the air. "We can help you. Your split personality doesn't..." A splitting headache made Brian cringe. "Dad, get out!" he yelled, grabbing his head. His father backed up and called for his wife. The two of them sat beside Brian and tried to calm him down. They thought they were helping, but the other part of Brian was steadily growing stronger. Brian sat on the couch, holding his backpack close. The more he thought about going to the cabin, the more he regretted his decision. How well did he know his aunt and his cousins? When had he even seen them last? His head jerked up when a loud ring pierced the silence. His father got to the door and welcomed in a woman that seemed to be in her mid-30s. "Mandy," he said affectionately, hugging her. "It's good to see you." "You too, brother," she said teasingly. She greeted Brian's mom and then smiled at Brian. "You've really grown the last time I seen you." Her red hair made her skin seem even paler than it already was. Brian felt like he was talking to a ghost, not his father's sister. Mandy?" his father said when Brian didn't reply. "Can I talk to you?" "Of course," she said, disappearing down the hall with her brother. Brian stared out of the large window that covered the wall before him. A minivan sat parked in front of the house. A quiet buzzing sound played in the back of his mind. "You ready to go, Brian?" Mandy had returned with Brian's father, and they both wore cheerful expressions. He nodded. "Have fun," his mother said, patting him on the back. Brian's father stood back and offered him a small smile. With effort, Brian managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Brian entered the van and sat in the back seat with one of his cousins, Aaron. Cassie sat in the passenger seat. After some introductions, the four rode in silence, besides the music that emanated from the radio. In the afternoon light, they made their way to the edge of town. Brian looked forward at the back of Cassie's seat. he couldn't help but notice Aaron smirking at him. Slowly, he turned his head to look at him. "Yes?" Brian said. "I just want to know how you're doing, cousin," he said in mock sincerity. Brian began to speak, but Aaron interrupted him, and in a low voice said, "Sorry, how are both of you doing?" Brian stared for a moment, that buzzing in his head silencing. Everything felt clearer as Brian felt his face burn. Biting his tongue, he turned to watch the blurring scenery outside the car window. "Not so good, huh?" Brian's fist tightened in his lap. "You got any friends?" Brian could hear his heart thumping loudly. That same anger he felt so often began to fill him. It was enough to make him face Aaron and open his mouth. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he replied, his voice venomous, "but I would stop." Aaron's smirk intensified. "But you see," he said, running a hand through his strobely blonde hair. "I can't do that, because I don't know which one of you is talking." Brian grit his teeth in frustration and tried to control his shaking hands. Aaron leaned in, and regardless of who you are now, "Brian," said Mandy, interrupting Aaron and turning down the music. Brian let out a sigh of relief as his attention focused on his aunt. He leaned back and answered every question she asked. Aaron's smirk never left his face. They got to the cabin just as the sun was setting. Its orange light reflected off the small lake near the cabin. As they exited the minivan, Brian studied the thinning trees that surrounded them. A glance backwards would show a winding path back to the town. But where he stood now, he felt too free. He had always craved some sort of freedom, just not this much at once. Inside the cabin, there were 2 rooms. Mandy and Cassie would be sharing one, while Aaron and Brian would room together in the other. They all settled down and had a quick meal at a small wooden table that took up nearly the whole kitchen. A window looked out towards the lake, sunlight now almost completely gone. Everyone agreed to get some rest and take advantage of an early start the next day. Brian and Aaron entered their room, and Brian began to climb to the top bunk of their bed. "Whoa," said Aaron. "What do you think you're doing?" Brian looked down at him and then glanced up at the bunk. "Going to bed," Brian said. Aaron shook his head. "Nah," he said with a sly grin on his face. "We're going exploring." "But I thought—" "Forget what you thought and shut up." Brian frowned and dropped to the cold floor, bare feet tensing at the contact. Aaron cracked the door open slightly and peered out into the darkness. After a couple more seconds, he opened the door all the way. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's go." Brian hesitated, but a look from Aaron made him follow, pausing only to slip on his shoes. As they tiptoed through the cabin, Brian absent-mindedly ran his fingers along the fading cuts on the side of his face. The door leading out of the cabin creaked when pulled open. Brian cringed at the noise. Adrenaline pumped through his veins when they took their first steps into the chilled autumn air. Leaning against the cabin near the door was Cassie, a look of excitement highlighting her features. She held an electric lantern and stepped forward when she saw the two. "Ready?" She looked at Brian, but it was Aaron who answered. "What do you think?" Cassie grinned and handed Aaron the lantern, letting him lead the way. She fell back to walk with Brian, leaves crunching beneath their feet. "How did you get out without getting caught?" Brian asked, curious. Cassie tossed her red hair over her shoulders. "I have my ways." She giggled. "I'm surprised you listened to Aaron and actually went with him." Brian raised an eyebrow and nodded. "Me too." "Ever been here before?" Cassie reached out and ran a hand across the trunk of a tree. Brian thought back to before he had obtained his disorder, memory still a blur. "Maybe once," he said. Brian gave her a side glance. "I don't remember." After several more steps through the forest, Aaron stopped in front of them. "And here we are," he said, pleased. Cassie walked to his side and beckoned Brian over. It took a while for his eyes to decide what he was looking at. In front of the trio was a gaping hole that led into darkness. It looked like some sort of elden time mine shaft. Wooden planks bordered the entrance. "Pretty neat, huh?" Cassie looked at Brian, elbowing his side. "I guess," he replied. "That's it?" Cassie placed herself directly in front of Brian. "I suppose you wouldn't understand unless you actually went inside." Brian felt his defenses going up. "Sure," he said, backing up. "We'll do that tomorrow then." Cassie laughed. Aaron looked at Brian. "Oh no, Split," he said, smiling at the nickname. "We didn't come out here just to go back. You're going to go in there now." Brian glanced behind him. He would have headed back if he knew the way. "Give him the lantern, Aaron." Cassie's excitement seemed to grow. "No," Brian said, heartbeat quickening. "I'm not going." "Come on!" Aaron handed him the light. "We've gone before, and we're perfectly fine. And anyway, Split, you wouldn't be going alone." Brian considered his options, cautiously accepting the lantern. At every comment about his disorder, he felt a weight in his chest. "You guys aren't coming with me?" Brian looked at Cassie and smiled sympathetically. "Nope," Aaron said. "Just you and yourself." Brian took a shaky breath and rubbed the side of his head. "Only one look and I'm out." Aaron laughed. "All the way to the end and back is what you'll be doing," he corrected. Brian began to tremble slightly, not from fear, but from slowly losing control. What triggered his changes, he didn't know. All Brian knew was that he had to leave before he did something he'd regret. He approached the mine's entrance, and Aaron and Cassie backed up. "We'll be here when you get back," Cassie said in a sing-song voice. "Don't count on it," Aaron said. Brian gripped the lantern tightly and took several slow steps into the abandoned mine. He turned around and Cassie gave him a thumbs up. At first, the mine was empty. Nothing but dirt and the smell of sulphur. But the further Brian went, the more his grasp of control slipped. He felt himself plummeting into another person. With every ounce of strength he had, he fought back. Soon, the lantern only illuminated small sections of the mine, hardly enough to see by. A headache made his temples throb, but he continued forward. If he turned back now, would they know he hadn't really gone to the end? Brian eventually began to see mine carts and paths that led in different directions, blocked off by fallen dirt and rocks. Tools rusted against the mine's walls. Suddenly, Brian heard whispering. It was barely audible at first, and he thought Aaron and Cassie had followed him. Then, after Brian took a couple more steps, they grew louder. It felt like the whispers would crush him. They seemed to be pushing on his mind from all directions, and he knew he was about to entirely lose control. Brian dropped to his knees and grabbed his head, lantern falling to the ground and extinguishing. He grunted as he fought back himself mentally. He was stuck. His brain felt like it was going to burst open. His fingers gripped his arms and he dug his nails deep into his skin. He focused on that pain, the pain that kept him rooted to reality. The whispering only increased, but he couldn't understand a word.
I'm not crazy.
Brian gasped.
I'm not crazy.
He cried over the whispers. His headache worsened, and he didn't know whether his eyes were closed or not. His body shook all over, and then suddenly, Brian was numb. He reached his arm out to find the lantern, new feeling replacing the agony.
I'm not crazy,
he repeated, sitting up.
We are crazy.
He reignited the lantern. A tingling feeling buzzed in his fingertips, and he pushed himself to his feet. The whispers were gone, replaced by a single voice in his head. Brian smiled and turned around, picking up a pickaxe in fairly good condition.
I'm not crazy,
a weak voice said in his mind. He ignored it. That wasn't a part of him anymore. Brian leaned forward as he walked, holding the lantern in one hand and dragging the pickaxe behind him. The light from the moon led him out of the mine. He had no idea how long he had been gone, but judging by the same thick darkness that hung in the air, not much time had passed. Brian hung the lantern around his belt loop and gripped the pickaxe with both of his hands. His bare arms bore several cuts from back in the mine. He wasn't surprised when he realized Aaron and Cassie had left him behind, but they couldn't have gotten too far. Relying on the moon and his lantern, Brian headed off for his cousins. The part of Brian that was in control now craved the thought of causing someone harm. It had always been him in pain, but not now. He felt great. As Brian wandered the forest of thin trees, he felt something nagging inside him like before. The crunching of leaves nearby dragged his focus away from that. You think he's still in there? Brian heard a girl whisper. Probably, came another voice. Oh, this will be hilarious. The girl giggled. It won't be if we can't find our way back. A couple more crunching leaves directed Brian to a large boulder in a small clearing. He rounded its corner and found Aaron and Cassie crouched behind it. They looked up, surprised. Aaron was the first to recover. "No way you went to the end, Split." He stood up, looking down at Brian slightly. Brian smiled. Why hadn't he liked that name before? "You're right," Brian said. He knelt down next to Cassie. "I thought you'd been here before." She stared at the pickaxe he held. "You got that from the mine?" she asked. Brian laughed, his heart beating fast from excitement. "Sure did." He rose and gave a little nod to Aaron. "See you later," he said with a hidden smile. Brian turned and began walking. "Wait!" Aaron said, grabbing his arm. He quickly reeled back, gaping at the cuts on Brian's arm. They were far worse than the ones on his face. "What the—" "Coming with you, Brian," Cassie said, standing next to Aaron. "Coming with me like you came with me into the mine?" Cassie's fierceness faltered. "No," Brian said, stepping close. "You're staying here." His heart practically sang in his chest as he lifted the pickaxe. Cassie stumbled back out of Brian's reach. "What the hell, Brian?" Aaron yelled, grabbing hold of his sister's hand. "Call me Split," he said as he brought the bottom of the pickaxe down, slamming it against Aaron's temple. Cassie screamed, "Ah!" and let go of his hand, her eyes wide, focused on Brian. He smiled. "Your turn." Brian used the pickaxe blade to lodge it into Cassie's stomach. The same tingling in his fingertips seemed to fill the air, joining the smell of rain. He hacked at Cassie's body again and again until she stopped making those gurgling noises. Some part of his mind screamed at him, telling him to stop, but he couldn't. Not yet. Aaron lay unconscious at Brian's feet. Brian's smile widened, but his grip on the pickaxe suddenly weakened. The part of his mind that screamed began to take control. Brian fell to his knees in the wet leaves, pickaxe in his lap. He looked frantically at the two bodies, realizing what he had done. Realizing that he had done this. Aaron was still breathing, but Cassie lay under a thick blanket of blood. "No," Brian whispered, his eyes widening. "No." He shook his head. I'm not." His voice caught, a loud sob left his mouth. Dark clouds were forming overhead when his first tear fell. He held the pickaxe close as he cried, his skin itching to be picked at. Soon, raindrops beat against Brian's head. Aaron began to stir. Brian looked at Cassie and hastily stood, holding the pickaxe still. Aaron's eyes were closed as he sat up, rubbing his head. In panic, Brian turned and ran away from Aaron and the body of what once was Cassie. He told himself that he needed to get back to the cabin. The rain fell harder. Eventually, Brian couldn't tell the difference between the rain and his tears. Brian saw the lake before he saw the cabin. The moon, partially covered in clouds, shone on its surface. He stood before the wooden door and took a deep breath. His nerves were on edge as he crept down to the bathroom, not entirely sure what he was doing. "Bran?" said Mandy from his room. Brian whirled around to face her. Her hair was a mess on her head. "Where are the others?" He moved the pickaxe carefully behind his back, his free hand shaking. "And why to have a cabin's lantern?" she asked. Brian cringed as his whole body began to shake. His eyes widened in fear of himself, and then he laughed. "You're right to worry about them, he said calmly. Mandy gave a puzzled look. "What?" "That's what mothers do." Brian smiled. "Except for the bad ones." "What do you mean?" Mandy tried to hide the look of terror on her face. "I don't understand, Brian. You..." Brian pulled the pickaxe from behind his back. "Don't call me that." He lunged forward, catching his aunt off guard. Soon Brian could really see the resemblance between her and her daughter. The blood on her skin didn't do much for her pale complexion. Brian staggered toward the bathroom, smile still on his face. He slammed the door and switched on the light. His lantern wasn't enough to show him what he wanted to see. He leant against the sink for support, gasping for air. The mirror revealed dark circles under his red-ringed eyes. Blood was splattered on his grey t-shirt. His shorts were worse. Brian let his fingers tear at the skin of his face, willing himself to wake up from this nightmare. He shot a glance at his blue eyes and was almost crushed by the pain he saw in them. Who was this boy he saw in the mirror? Brian let his pickaxe fall to the floor. Brian opened a cupboard beneath the sink. He found several pieces of cloth and bound a white one over his eyes. It was thin enough for him to see through, but not for anyone else to see him. Immediately, it was stained with crimson red. His muscles ached as he retrieved the pickaxe and headed for the room he and Aaron were supposed to share. He replaced his blood-stained shorts with blue jeans, but didn't bother with his shirt. Brian himself hadn't packed much, so he rummaged through Aaron's things and found a dark collared jacket. He couldn't see his eyes in the mirror. His vision was tinged with red. Brian's dark blonde hair was still wet, resting against the top of the cloth over his eyes. Carefully, Brian felt the cuts on his face and arms, a smile involuntarily moving his lips upwards into a sneer. Several emotions bombarded his mind at once. Exhaustion and pain were amongst them. Why should Brian try to control himself anymore? And a stocking cap. Brian didn't want anyone to recognize him when he didn't even know who he was anymore. He re-entered the bathroom, avoiding Mandy's body. It would be easier if he just let go. Pickaxe in hand, Brian set out to satisfy the monster inside him.